The winds howled through the jagged cliffs as Thorvald stood at the edge, looking out across the stormy seas. The horizon was a grim slate gray, the sky heavy with the promise of another battle. Behind him, the longships rocked in the choppy waters, their dragon-shaped prows cutting through the waves. His men stood ready, shields raised, swords at their sides. "Today, we make history." Thorvald's voice boomed, carrying over the crashing waves. His men cheered, their battle cries mingling with the wind. "Our ancestors' blood flows in our veins, and today, we spill more," he shouted, his gaze turning toward the distant shore. The village was small but well fortified, and the glint of spears and shields reflected in the light of the setting sun. "They think they can stand against us," Thorvald muttered. "They'll learn differently soon enough." With one final look, he turned to his warriors. "For Odin, for Valhalla." With that, they rowed forward into the tempest. The longship grounded against the rocky shore with a deafening crash. Thorvald leapt off the ship, landing with a heavy thud as his boots sank into the wet sand. He drew his sword, the iron blade gleaming in the dim light of the setting sun. "Form up," he shouted to his men, and with a chorus of battle cries they followed him onto the shore. The defenders of the village stood behind crude barricades, their eyes wide with fear as the Viking warriors advanced. Thorvald's lips curled into a grim smile. "Let them feel our fury," he muttered. The clash of metal rang out as the Vikings surged forward, shields raised, swords flashing in the fading light. Thorvald led the charge, cutting down a defender with a single stroke, his sword arching through the air. "No mercy," he shouted, his voice echoing across the beach. The battle raged on, with Thorvald cutting a bloody path through the defenders. His sword cleaved through armor and flesh with ease, his warriors fighting alongside him in a frenzy of bloodlust. The village defenders, though brave, were no match for the relentless fury of the Vikings. "Push forward," Thorvald shouted as he hacked his way toward the village gates. But as he neared the entrance, a figure stepped out from behind the barricades, a towering man with a war axe. "You won't take this village without a fight," the man growled, his voice deep and menacing. Thorvald met his gaze, his eyes narrowing. "I came for more than just a fight," he said, his voice cold. "I came to take everything." With a roar, the two warriors collided, their weapons clashing with a force that shook the earth beneath them. The clash between Thorvald and the defender was fierce, each blow exchanged with lethal force. Thorvald's speed was his advantage, his sword striking like a serpent's bite. The defender, however, was a mountain of muscle, his axe swinging with devastating power. Thorvald ducked under a swing, rolling to the side and slashing at the defender's side. The man grunted, but didn't falter. "You fight well, Viking," he grunted, sweat dripping down his brow. Thorvald's lips curled into a grim smile. "You fight with honor, but you will fall like the rest." With a final powerful strike, Thorvald disarmed the defender, sending the war axe skittering across the sand. The man fell to his knees, panting heavily. "It's over," Thorvald said coldly, standing over him. "Tell your people this is the price of defiance." With the village defenses broken, Thorvald's warriors began to pillage, their cries of victory echoing through the air. Thorvald stood atop a hill, his gaze sweeping over the village as flames began to rise from the burning buildings. His men celebrated below, but he remained calm, his mind already on the next conquest. "This is just the beginning," Thorvald muttered to Rurik, who stood beside him. "We take this village today, but tomorrow we claim more." Rurik nodded, his face grim but proud. "The gods will favor us, Thorvald. We've made our mark." Thorvald turned to face the horizon, his eyes hard with resolve. "We'll carve our names into the sagas, Rurik, and the world will remember us." With that he turned away, his warriors following him as they prepared for the next battle. The victory over the village was just the beginning. Thorvald and his warriors sailed onward, their ships cutting through the open sea like predators on the hunt. The horizon before them was wild and untamed, the path ahead fraught with both promise and danger. As the days stretched on, Thorvald grew more resolute in his purpose. His reputation was spreading, and with each village they conquered, his name became a legend. But there were whispers of a greater force, an enemy that would not fall so easily. One evening, as they approached a larger, more fortified settlement, Rurik spoke up. "Thorvald," he said, his voice low, "this one won't be as easy as the others. They know we're coming." Thorvald turned to face his lieutenant, his eyes cold and calculating. "Then we'll make sure they never see us coming. We attack at dawn." The wind howled through the sails, carrying the promise of another bloody battle. The night passed in tense silence. Thorvald and his warriors knew that the enemy was preparing for them, their defenses growing stronger by the hour. As dawn broke, casting a cold light over the sea, Thorvald gave the signal. The Longships closed in on the shores of the fortified settlement, The walls were high, their battlements lined with archers ready to rain arrows down on them. But Thorvald had no intention of meeting them head-on. "We strike from the shadows," he said to Rurik, his voice steady and full of resolve. "We hit them where they least expect it." With a swift command, the Vikings began to disembark, their ships pulling close to the hidden beach behind the settlement. As they crept through the forest, the scent of the sea still heavy in the air, the warriors readied their weapons. The village was close, and with it, the challenge that would test their strength. The forest was dense, the path forward uncertain, but Thorvald and his warriors moved with purpose. They could hear the distant sounds of the enemy preparing, but they remained hidden, their steps light on the soft earth. They reached the base of the village walls without being seen, the air thick with the scent of wood and earth. Thorvald motioned for Rurik to follow him as they approached a hidden gap in the defenses. "This is it," Thorvald whispered, his voice filled with intensity. "We get inside, and we take it all. No mercy." Rurik nodded, his face grim but resolute. "Ready when you are, Thorvald." The tension in the air was palpable, but Thorvald knew that this was their moment. With a final glance at his men, he drew his sword, stepping forward into the shadows of the village, ready to take what was rightfully theirs. The Viking warriors crept through the hidden gap in the village walls, their hearts pounding in their chests. Once inside, the village was a maze of tight alleys and wooden huts. The air was filled with the scent of cooking fires and the distant sounds of the villagers going about their morning routine. Thorvald motioned for his men to split into smaller groups, each tasked with taking out key targets, the leaders, the archers, and the supply caches. "We move quickly and silently," Thorvald whispered, his eyes scanning the surroundings. As they advanced, a villager suddenly appeared in their path, his face filled with shock. Without hesitation, Thorvald stepped forward, his sword flashing. The man fell, silent and swift. "No mercy," Thorvald muttered as he moved on. The Vikings pushed forward, their blood running hot with the thrill of battle, knowing that the victory was within their grasp. The battle unfolded in a blur of violence and bloodshed. The Vikings hit their targets with precision, cutting down any who dared to resist. Thorvald's men tore through the village, their battle cries echoing through the streets. The sound of metal clashing against metal filled the air as Thorvald's warriors overwhelmed the villagers. The resistance was fierce, but it was clear they were no match for the ruthless force of the Vikings. As Thorvald reached the center of the village, he came face to face with the leader, a tall, broad-shouldered man, his eyes burning with defiance. "You think you can just take everything?" the leader spat. "I'll die before I let you claim this village." Thorvald's expression remained cold, his voice steady. "You will die then, but your people will know who stands victorious." With that, he raised his sword and charged, the final battle about to begin. Thorvald's blade sank deep into the chest of the village leader, the man's defiant glare fading as his life slipped away. The sound of his body hitting the dirt was drowned by the cheers of Thorvald's warriors. The village was theirs now, and Thorvald knew that with each victory, their power grew stronger. Yet, something gnawed at him. As he stood over the fallen leader, the bloodied sword still in his hand, his thoughts turned to the future. "This is only the beginning," he muttered to himself. Rurik approached, wiping blood from his axe. The villagers are broken, Thorvald. What now? Thorvald's gaze hardened as he looked toward the horizon. We push forward. There's a larger enemy waiting for us, and I will not stop until we see this war through. The wind picked up as if in response, carrying the scent of both victory and the inevitable conflict yet to come. After the battle, Thorvald and his warriors took their rest. But his mind was far from peaceful. As night fell and the stars flickered above, Rurik sat beside him, staring into the flickering fire. "What do you see when you look ahead, Thorvald?" he asked quietly. Thorvald looked into the fire, his face drawn. "I see more battles, more villages to conquer. We are at the brink of something great, Rurik, but I fear that even we may not be able to hold it." Rurik glanced at him, raising an eyebrow. "Are you afraid?" Thorvald shook his head. "Not afraid, but cautious. We've made many enemies in our path, and we still have much to prove." Rurik chuckled darkly. "You're a man of war, Thorvald. The gods may smile on us, but you know better than anyone that the path to glory is paved with blood." Thorvald nodded solemnly. "Then we will carve our path." The days that followed were filled with preparation for the next raid, but Thorvald could sense that something was shifting. The village had been a quick victory, but now word of their conquest spread, and with it, new challenges arose. As Thorvald surveyed the map of the surrounding territories, a shadow fell over him. "They're gathering their forces," Rurik said from behind him. Thorvald's eyes were cold as he studied the map, his finger tracing the paths that would lead them to the next target. "Let them come," he muttered. "They think they can stop us. They will learn differently." The night before the raid, Thorvald gathered his warriors, his voice firm. "Tomorrow we march on the heart of their power. We will show them the strength of our might." The warriors responded with a unified roar, the fire of battle igniting in their hearts once again. The time for hesitation was over. The march toward their next target was long, and the land grew more rugged the farther they went. The once green fields turned to barren stretches of earth, and the air felt thick with the promise of bloodshed. As they approached the fortress, the sheer scale of it took Thorvald by surprise. Towers loomed high above them, and the gates were guarded by well-trained soldiers. "This will be no easy feat," Rurik said, his voice filled with the same grim resolve that Thorvald felt. "They'll be ready for us." Thorvald's gaze never wavered from the fortress ahead. "Let them prepare. We'll break their gates and their spirits." The Vikings halted just beyond the reach of the fortress archers, and Thorvald signaled for his men to spread out. "We take no prisoners today. This fortress is ours." With that, they began their final march toward the enemy stronghold. The battle for the fortress was unlike any Thorvald had faced before. The defenders fought with desperation, their arrows raining down on the advancing Vikings. But Thorvald's men were relentless, their shields raised as they charged the gates. "Push forward," Thorvald shouted, as his warriors clashed against the gates, their axes striking with thunderous force. The sounds of metal clashing, men shouting, and the creaking of the wooden gates being forced open filled the air. As the gates finally gave way, Thorvald led the charge into the heart of the fortress, cutting down any who stood in his way. The defenders fell quickly, their resolve shattered by the overwhelming force of the Vikings. At the heart of the fortress, Thorvald found the enemy commander, a man who stood tall, his sword gleaming. "You've come far, Viking," the commander said, his voice defiant but weary. Thorvald grinned, his sword raised high. "And I will go farther still." The dust settled over the now silent fortress, as Thorvald stood victorious, his bloodied sword still raised. The cries of the fallen defenders echoed in the distance, but there was no celebration, only the aftermath of yet another brutal victory. Thorvald surveyed the carnage around him, his mind already focused on the next step. Rurik approached, wiping blood from his face, his expression grim but proud. "Another fortress fallen, Thorvald, but there are whispers. The enemy is gathering in greater numbers." Thorvald's eyes narrowed as he turned to face his lieutenant. "Let them gather. They can't stop us. We've tasted victory, and now we take it all." With the fall of the fortress, their victory was solidified, but Thorvald knew that the hardest battles were yet to come. The war was not over, it had only just begun. "We march at first light," he commanded, "and we leave no survivors in our wake." As dawn broke, Thorvald's army prepared to march on. They had little time to rest. Each victory brought new enemies, new territories to conquer. The camp was bustling with activity as warriors sharpened their weapons, fixed their shields, and packed their supplies. Rurik walked over to Thorvald, who was staring into the distance, his mind lost in thought. "You've been quiet," Rurik said, his tone more curious than accusatory. "Are you worried?" Thorvald turned to him, his expression unreadable. "Worried," he repeated, a wry smile tugging at his lips. "No, but we cannot grow complacent. The enemy will send their best after us. We need to be ready for whatever comes next." Rurik nodded, his own thoughts mirroring his leader's. The time for hesitation had passed. Now, they would strike before the enemy had a chance to react. The march was long, and the land grew more hostile with each passing day. The terrain became increasingly rugged, filled with jagged rocks and deep ravines. The Vikings pressed on, their spirits unbroken despite the hardships they faced. Thorvald led them, his mind constantly thinking of the next step. As they reached the top of a hill, the sound of drums reached their ears. The enemy was close. They had been found. "They know we're coming," Rurik said, his eyes scanning the distant horizon. Thorvald's lips curled into a grim smile. "Let them come. We'll be ready." The Vikings took position on the hill, preparing for the battle that was about to unfold. As the enemy closed in, Thorvald felt a surge of energy coursing through him. The time for talk was over. "We fight, and we win," he said firmly, raising his sword. The battle began with a thunderous clash. Thorvald's men fought with the ferocity of wolves, charging down the hill toward the waiting enemy. The sound of metal meeting metal rang out across the field, the air filled with the cries of battle. Thorvald fought at the front, his sword cutting through the enemy ranks with brutal efficiency. He felt the weight of each strike, the heat of the battle building with every swing. Rurik was beside him, his axe slicing through the air as he decimated their opponents. The enemy was larger, but they lacked the discipline and ferocity of the Vikings. Slowly, the tide turned in Thorvald's favor. "Push them back," he bellowed, his voice carrying over the chaos. The Vikings responded with renewed strength, their spirits lifted by their leader's command. As the battle raged on, the enemy's resolve began to falter. Thorvald's warriors pushed forward relentlessly, their strength and unity too much for the opposing force to withstand. The enemy commander, a tall figure in dark armor, stood at the rear, watching as his forces crumbled. Thorvald spotted him from across the battlefield, and began to make his way through the carnage, cutting down anyone who stood in his path. When he finally reached the commander, they locked eyes. "You've come far, Viking," the commander sneered. "But you will not take me so easily." Thorvald's expression remained cold as he stepped forward. "You are already defeated," he said. "Now, you die like the rest." With a swift strike, Thorvald ended the commander's life, his sword sinking deep into the man's chest. The battle was won. The aftermath of the battle was filled with the scent of smoke and death. Thorvald stood at the edge of the field, watching his warriors loot the fallen enemies, their triumphant cries rising into the smoky air. The victory was hard-earned, but Thorvald's mind was elsewhere. The land they had conquered was vast, but the challenges were only growing. He knew that the path ahead was far from certain. As the warriors celebrated, Thorvald's thoughts turned to the whispers he'd heard. There were rumors of a mighty force gathering to oppose him, a force led by someone who was not so easily beaten. "This will not be our last battle," Thorvald murmured to himself. Rurik approached, his face lined with exhaustion but filled with pride. "What's next, Thorvald?" he asked. Thorvald's gaze was steely. "We strike while they are still regrouping. We take them before they can organize their defense." The sun rose on the following day, casting a blood-red hue over the wreckage of the battlefield. Thorvald stood at the head of his warriors, the wind tugging at his fur cloak as they prepared for the next assault. The enemy had retreated to a heavily fortified stronghold further inland, but Thorvald was not one to wait. "Today, we strike their heart," he said to his men, his voice carrying over the ranks. "We leave nothing behind. We take everything." His warriors cheered, their swords raised in salute to their leader. "We know the enemy is regrouping, but we're faster. We strike now before they're ready." With that, Thorvald led his warriors into the dense forest, their movements swift and sure. The battle for their next conquest would soon begin. The stronghold loomed ahead, its massive stone walls towering over the surrounding landscape. Thorvald and his warriors approached cautiously, knowing that the enemy would not be caught off guard again. As they neared the walls, Thorvald held up his hand, signaling for his men to halt. "We won't take this by force alone," he said, his voice low. "We'll draw them out." With swift precision, Thorvald's warriors set fires around the perimeter of the stronghold, sending plumes of smoke into the air. The enemy defenders took the bait, rushing out to put out the flames. It was then that Thorvald gave the signal. "Now!" he shouted. The Vikings surged forward, their weapons drawn, catching the enemy outside their walls by surprise. Thorvald led the charge, his sword raised high as he cleaved through the first wave of defenders. The battle raged fiercely outside the walls of the stronghold, with Thorvald and his warriors cutting down any who stood in their way. The enemy was well trained, but their resolve wavered as the Vikings pushed forward relentlessly. Thorvald's heart pounded with the thrill of the fight, his sword moving with deadly precision as he cleaved through enemy ranks. "We break them here," Thorvald shouted, his voice ringing out over the chaos. Rurik fought beside him, his axe slicing through the air. "We'll carve a path straight to their commander," he called back. Thorvald nodded, his gaze fixed on the main gate of the stronghold, where the commander awaited. "We end this today," Thorvald said, his voice like iron. With a final battle cry, he surged forward, making his way toward the heart of the enemy stronghold. The enemy commander stood at the gates, his armor gleaming in the smoke-filled air, his sword raised in challenge. "You've come far, Viking," the commander said, his voice filled with defiance. Thorvald stepped forward, his sword still dripping with the blood of the fallen. "And I will go further still," he said, his voice low and menacing. The two warriors locked eyes, the tension between them thick. With a roar, the commander charged, his sword aimed for Thorvald's chest. But Thorvald was quicker. With a swift motion, he sidestepped the attack and drove his sword deep into the commander's side. The man fell, his blood staining the earth beneath them. Thorvald stood over him, his chest heaving as he surveyed the battlefield. "This land is ours," he said coldly. The stronghold was taken, and with it, another victory in the saga of Thorvald's conquests. The conquest of the stronghold was a turning point, but Thorvald knew the enemy's resolve had only been temporarily broken. As his warriors celebrated their victory, Thorvald's mind turned to the greater war ahead. "We've made our mark," Rurik said, walking up to him, his eyes scanning the horizon. "But it feels like there's more yet to come." Thorvald nodded, his gaze fixed on the distant mountains. "There's always more," he replied, his voice low but resolute. "Our enemies will gather again. The real test will be holding what we have taken, keeping it from slipping through our fingers." He turned to his warriors, who were cheering and raising their mugs in celebration. "Enjoy this moment, but tomorrow we march again. The gods didn't favor us with victories to rest on. We have more to conquer." With those words, Thorvald left the celebrations behind and walked to the edge of the camp, his mind already preparing for the battles to come. The following morning, the Viking army packed their gear and prepared to leave the stronghold. The sky was still dark with early morning mist, and the air was cool against their skin. Thorvald gathered his generals around a map of the surrounding territories. "We've taken this stronghold, but we know the enemy is not far off," he said, pointing to the map. "We move quickly, we strike hard, and we take everything in our path." One of the generals, a seasoned warrior named Bjorn, raised an eyebrow. "And if they regroup?" he asked. Thorvald's lips curled into a fierce grin. Then we break them again. And again. We will not stop until we've claimed it all. The generals nodded in agreement, their eyes filled with the same fire that burned within Thorvald. The warriors packed up their camp, ready to follow their leader into battle once again. The march toward their next target began. The march was long, and Thorvald's warriors grew weary as they crossed barren lands and thick forests. But Thorvald's presence kept their spirits high. He moved through his men like a force of nature, his commands clear, his leadership unwavering. As the days passed, whispers of the Viking conquest spread, and the villages ahead grew nervous. Thorvald knew that the enemy would soon attempt to make a stand. As they approached a vast plain, Rurik turned to Thorvald. "The next battle will be decisive," he said, his eyes narrowing. "If we take this next settlement, we will have control of the heart of their lands." Thorvald nodded, his gaze steely. "Then we take it. We fight for the future of our people, Rurik. We fight for everything." With that, the Vikings continued their march, knowing that the next battle would determine the course of their conquest. When they reached the settlement, the atmosphere was thick with tension. The villagers had prepared, their walls fortified with sharpened stakes and makeshift barricades. Thorvald surveyed the scene, his gaze calm but calculating. "They think their walls will stop us," he muttered. Rurik stepped forward, his axe in hand. "We'll show them how wrong they are." Thorvald smiled grimly. "We strike at dawn. We take their gates, we crush their warriors, and we show them the strength of the north." As night fell, Thorvald's men gathered in silence, preparing for the assault. The air grew cold as the moon rose, casting an eerie glow over the battlefield. Thorvald stood at the head of his warriors, his sword drawn ready for the coming fight. "Tomorrow we take what is ours," he said, his voice a low growl. At dawn the battle began with a deafening roar as Thorvald's men surged forward, their war cries echoing through the air. The clash of metal rang out as the Vikings attacked the village's gates, their axes and swords striking against the wooden walls with brutal force. Thorvald fought at the forefront, his sword cutting through the enemy's defenses like a hot knife through butter. The villagers fought with desperation, but it was clear they were no match for the overwhelming force of Thorvald's warriors. "Push forward," Thorvald shouted as he cleaved through another defender. "We break them today." As the gates finally fell, the Vikings flooded into the settlement, their weapons flashing as they overwhelmed the remaining defenders. Thorvald's warriors pushed through the streets, and soon the settlement was in their hands. The battle was won, but Thorvald knew this would not be the end. More battles were ahead. Thorvald stood at the edge of the settlement, overlooking the land they had just conquered. The sun was setting, casting long shadows over the battlefield. The fires from the village still smoldered in the distance, and the air smelled of ash and victory. His warriors were busy looting and celebrating, but Thorvald felt a heavy weight settle over him. The conquest was far from over, and the forces they had yet to face were formidable. Rurik approached him, his face grim but filled with pride. "We've taken another village, Thorvald, but you know this won't be the last." Thorvald nodded, his expression hardening. "No, it won't be the last, but we've made our mark. The world will know our name." He turned to face his lieutenant, his voice cold and determined. "We leave at dawn. The next target is waiting for us." With a final glance at the burning village, Thorvald made his way to the war tent. There was no time to rest. The following morning, Thorvald's warriors packed their gear in silence, their faces somber and focused. The march continued, and the land ahead grew more treacherous. The winter chill set in, and the roads became harder to travel. Rurik walked beside Thorvald as they made their way toward the next settlement, their path lined with snow-covered trees. "Do you think this will be the one that finally breaks us?" Rurik asked, his voice filled with concern. Thorvald glanced at him, his gaze piercing. "We've fought harder battles and come out victorious. Nothing will break us, not now." Rurik nodded, but there was a hint of doubt in his eyes. The Vikings were strong, but even the strongest could falter when faced with an enemy determined enough. "You're right," Rurik said quietly. "We're not done yet, and we'll keep fighting until it's finished. Thorvald's jaw tightened. That's exactly how I intend to win. As they neared the next settlement, the tension in the air was palpable. The village was heavily fortified, its walls thick and high, with guards posted at every vantage point. Thorvald knew this would not be a simple battle. "They're waiting for us," Rurik muttered, eyeing the defenders atop the walls. Thorvald nodded. "Let them wait. We'll make them regret it." The Vikings moved quickly, setting up camp in the surrounding woods, hiding their numbers from the enemy. By nightfall, they had prepared for the attack. Thorvald gathered his warriors around the fire. "We strike at dawn," he said, his voice carrying over the crackling fire. "We breach their gates and we take everything. No mercy. They wanted war, and now they'll have it." His warriors cheered, their spirits lifted by his words. The final push would come tomorrow. The village would either fall or stand as the last obstacle in Thorvald's path. At dawn the Vikings were ready. Thorvald's men moved like shadows through the early morning fog, silent and swift. They reached the gates of the village just as the first light of day broke across the sky. Thorvald stood at the front, his sword drawn, his face set in grim determination. "Now," he commanded, his voice low but powerful. The warriors rushed forward, crashing into the gates with all their might. The wooden barricade splintered under the force, and the Vikings surged through, weapons raised. The defenders, caught off guard, scrambled to respond, but it was too late. Thorvald led the charge, his sword cutting through enemy forces as they tried to regroup. The battle was fierce, but the outcome was never in question. Thorvald's Vikings were unstoppable. "This is our village now," he shouted as the last of the defenders fell. With the gates breached and the enemy in disarray, the village was claimed. The battle was short but brutal, and soon the village was theirs. Thorvald stood in the center of the chaos, his sword dripping with blood. Around him his warriors celebrated, but his mind was already turning to the next move. "We've conquered another land," Rurik said, stepping beside him, wiping blood from his axe. "But it's not over. There are more enemies waiting." Thorvald nodded, his gaze hard as steel. "Yes, but we've shown them the strength of the North. The world will hear our name." He looked out over the fallen village, his heart heavy with the weight of what was to come. "We've fought for this land, Rurik, and we'll fight for more. Until we've taken everything, we will not stop." The Vikings gathered around their leader, ready for the next challenge. The world was vast, but Thorvald was determined to carve his name into it.